Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight I want to do the third part of the problem series, and this one was going to be the problems, maybe some solutions. So many of the I've talked just about Peterson and Gladwell, but they're just sort of exemplars. I didn't mean to pick on them in particular. They're just very famous for some of the kinds of logical errors and misuses of evidence that are common in our new era. And in some ways, what we're doing is, or I think what's happening is we're trying to deal with a new medium, with new information that's coming to us in different ways. And so once again, as this happened every time this has happened in history, we have to make adjustments and sort of retrain our minds to deal with the way evidence and arguments are coming at us as new mediums and new technologies are developed. And there's no reason we should expect this to be different, and it's not. However, the rules of use of evidence and argumentation haven't changed very much. And so I think just looking at some of the common errors, using examples from some of the material we've seen and from presenting new examples, we can talk about how maybe to begin to address those. And then I'll conclude with a sort of an argument, I guess, of my own about why this is both challenging and I think invigorating and interesting. So hopefully this will be more upbeat and a different tenor than what we've been addressing in the previous two. But like I said, just the third sort of solutions-ish for some of the problems, things to ponder when facing this. And a couple of the main kind of category areas that we see, one is the anecdote. And so this is the art form that many writers use. And the problem with the anecdote is an anecdote is just a small story. And so we tell stories to us all the time to help us comprehend the world. And this is not unreasonable and not in itself false. The problem is we always have to ask, is this anecdote meaningful? Is it accurate? Is it useful? So two examples, these are very simple. Like I say, Gladwell is filled with these anecdotes. Sometimes they're good, and sometimes, as I mentioned, they're just either not true or they're misleading. They are not anecdotes. So I mentioned last time that he uses the anecdote of the hush puppy shoe becoming fashionable. And it's like, okay, that's a true anecdote. It's a true story. But is it a story that informs about wider subjects? And you always have to ask yourself that about anecdotes. And so example of this is one I like is, I'm walking down the street in town, minding my own business, and all of a sudden a bus swerves and pulls up on the sidewalk and almost hits me, and I leap out of the way at the last second. Now, this is a true story, but is it a meaningful story? Does this tell me anything meaningful? Now, I could conclude from this anecdote that buses are trying to kill me, right? Like buses are out trying to kill me. Now, that you can see where someone could derive that conclusion. However, this is clearly a poor conclusion unless lots of buses swerved up on sidewalks and tried to kill me under many different circumstances. Then I could sort of go, okay. And this is the problem with the anecdote. Even if it's true, a bus tries to swerve up, a bus swerves up for whatever reason on the sidewalk and you jump out of the way at the last minute, doesn't mean the conclusion that you draw from that anecdote is necessarily accurate. These are different things. But we're often misled by this. And what happens is people tell us stories and then they tell us what it means and we kind of go, oh, okay. And so one healthy way to begin to learn to deal with this is anytime you're being told a story, if you can stop and say, okay, before you get the punchline, before it's explained to you what that means, you can ask yourself, hey, wait a second, what does that mean to me? What would I conclude from this story if nobody ever told me what it meant? And I'm a big fan of classical music, love classical music, listen to it all the time. But one of the things that irritates me is what's called program music. And so people always say, oh, this is, whatever, Haydn's Storm at Sea piece. And if you listen to this, you'll hear the exciting sound of a storm at sea and so on and so forth. And there's lots of this, and they talk about it all the time. And so what's being happened is they're telling you what the music sounds like before you hear the music. I've always wanted them to run the experiment the other way around, which is to play a piece of music, maybe Respighi's The Pines or Fountains of Rome, and say, okay, what do you hear? And if someone listened to the Respighi piece, having never heard it before, and said, you know what I really think this is? This is a representation of the fountains of Rome. or I would be, I mean, that would be incredible, right? It would be like, wow, you listened to a piece of music and derived that. See, I just don't think people, do that. If you listen to the Afternoon of the Fawn or something from Debussy, or, one piece of music that supposedly sets the mood and the emotional tone of something, sure. But to say, oh, this is the Grand Canyon, this is the seaside in Normandy, this is the wind blowing across the plain, right? It just, I just think this is not going to happen. But if they tell you ahead of time what you're about to hear, and then they play the music, now you're ready to understand the music or the anecdote, whatever it is, within that context. And so if you can possibly find it, to stop a story and go, okay, somebody just told me this story. Now, what do I think it means if it were just on my own? Would I conclude that the bus is trying to kill me? Would I think that, oh, the radio stations don't want to play this artist, that means the radio stations are wrong and everybody else is right? Or would I think maybe, something else could be going on? Are there other explanations that might help fill this? And so with anecdotes, again, these little stories, we find them amazingly convincing, but they're often misleading. And another example of this, same idea, a little more complicated and also quite common, is we love to use examples from history. Also love history. History, the past remembered, right? So what part of history you remember really matters. And so when people use historical examples, they'll say, oh, Rome, the Roman Empire collapsed because of decadence. And because they collapsed because of decadence, we're becoming decadent. We're going to collapse unless we stop being decadent, right? Sort of your classic oversimplified arc there. Again, two questions to ask, at least two questions to ask if you want to try and think about these, is go, one, is the anecdote true? Did the Roman Empire collapse because of decadence? Yeah, blah. There's not a lot of evidence that the Roman Empire collapsed because of decadence. There's a lot of evidence the Roman Empire had lots and lots of other problems. Also, the Eastern Roman Empire didn't collapse for a couple of centuries more, and there's no evidence they were significantly less, were they incredibly less corrupt? Is that why they survived? How do you calculate the Roman Empire? What counts? These sorts of things. So one, and then two, are we like the Roman Empire? Okay, so this is an analogy, right? This is where an anecdote becomes like an analogy. So people tell a story and they say, oh, this is like the United States. The Roman Empire is like the United States. So if we become decadent, we'll decline like Rome declined and fell. And, blah. I think, no. So there's a very dubious where the Romans collapsed because they were decadent, very dubious that we're like Rome, enough to make that, even if it were true, to make it seem like we're going to collapse because of decadence as well. So it's just another way. So you get two levels of this, where you get very simple stories like Gladwell uses, but then you also get some sort of historical analogies and stories that are then sort of applied to the modern era. And it doesn't mean there's nothing to learn from history, quite the contrary. And sometimes there are accurate comparisons to be made. However, you just have to be really careful, because history is basically being retold as a series of anecdotes. Often, in huge history books, very, very long anecdotes with lots of footnotes. But the remembered past is just a story of a lot of stories that could be told. So the question is this story, again, fairly accurate? And two, does it really carry, resonance, merit? Is it a fair comparison or a fair extension to apply in the modern age? And again, sometimes yes, sometimes it's just not. And so that's always a tricky one with stories and anecdotes. Next one would be the single point of evidence problem. And this, I think, comes from our tradition of using scientific ideas from chemistry and physics in particular. So the scientific revolution, driven not just by, but hugely by breakthroughs in chemistry and physics, sort of set the pattern for thinking and the pattern for uses of evidence, even when those patterns aren't particularly applicable outside of the hard sciences. And one way you see this is where it's as if a single piece of evidence can over everything that was known before. And because in theory, this is true-ish in science, rarely does it ever work out this way. But if you can discover, a particle, if you could discover a particle between helium and hydrogen that behaved with different kinds of just some kind of weird particle that had never been seen before, like the periodic table would be totally pitched, right? It would create huge problems for chemistry. But probably not going to find that particle. You could maybe artificially make something strange in the lab, and that would be cool to experiment with. But, these sorts of small variations, or if we found, I'm trying to think of an example that would really throw things off, or people, if you don't want to believe in geology, right, if you could find something that was really, really out of place, like if they dug deep into the mantle of the earth, doing a diamond mine or a copper or gold mine, maybe they go pretty deep, and you found, a skeleton of a bunny rabbit, right? That would create problems, right? But even that would not really throw everything off, because there's so much other evidence for geology that, one piece of evidence does not really totally upset things. But we sort of got this idea from the physical sciences that one piece of evidence can overthrow a whole system of thinking. And this is, again, an anecdote that's often told, even though it's really not that representative of how even the hard sciences actually work. So a couple examples. One is, this actually comes from Steven Pinker, and some other people who have pointed out that, look, the Jews have won lots and lots and lots of Nobel Prizes, which they have. I mean, it's a ridiculous number of Jewish Nobel Prizes. Just wildly, like unbelievably overrepresented of the size of the population of Jews in the world. Ipso facto, people go, well, we have to explain that. Okay, fair enough. It's a fair question. Let's see if we can explain it. And then often the argument is, well, there must be something genetic there. And it's like, okay, now it doesn't mean there can't be something genetic there, but is there necessarily something genetic there? And is winning Nobel Prizes a good piece of evidence for anything? Could be. It's certainly a weird thing, to be so overly representative, but let's see if we can find another piece of evidence. And this is the thing. Anytime you get one piece of evidence, you always want to ask yourself, is there other evidence that we could possibly find to corroborate, or that would, mediate or complicate what I've just been presented? But so often, and particularly in these briefer books and briefer arguments and briefer videos, people go, well, here's one piece of evidence, and that shows blah, 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 blah. And it's like, okay, can we think of anything? Can we find anything that might suggest there's at least trouble with that piece of evidence? And if you look at Jews with a Nobel Prize, you go, okay, well, this Nobel Prize is a good metric. And one piece of evidence you could think of, you don't have to think very long to come up with, is how many Chinese Nobel laureates have there been? Well, between the inception of the Nobel Prizes, right around 1900, a little earlier, and 1957, so that was about 69 years or so, 0 Chinese Nobel laureates. And from 1957 to 86, there were only 4. So basically, for the first 100 years almost of the Nobel Prize, only 4 Chinese people won Nobel Prizes. So if Jews winning lots of Nobel Prizes mean Jews are really smart, perhaps genetically and superior in intelligence, then perhaps Chinese people didn't win Nobel Prizes because they're really stupid and perhaps genetically inferior in their stupidity. Of course, when you phrase it this way, we begin to become suspicious, and people might point out, like, hey, why might the Chinese not have been winning so many Nobel Prizes in those first 100 years? One thing that leaps to mind is, of course, China was having a bit of a rough century, one could put it fairly. Not at the high point of the development of their civilization, having, sort of imperialism, lots of wars, lots of civil wars, lots of disruption. So that's one problem. 2, of course, there was incredible racism at work. 3, the Nobel Prize Committee really did not have access to Chinese as a language, so this sort of automatically kept anybody who was working in Chinese sort of out of the running. China not really connected with the rest of the world, and so on and so forth. So you can see why there were these huge barriers to Chinese participation in the Nobel Prize, and hence, for the first 100 years, they won about 4, which is to say not many, considering that they make up a really considerable percentage of the global population. So the notion that it would automatically indicate that the Chinese are somehow intellectually inferior is, let us say, problematic and pretty much just wrong on the face of it. And of course, now, a couple of years later, we realize, yeah, they seem to have plenty of smart people over there in China, and they're doing just fine. Thank you very much. So then if we go back to the Jewish question, we can say, oh, well, now we see that one group, very large group, and with clearly many intellectual talents could be systematically excluded for various reasons. Is it possible that the converse could be true, that a small group who is overrepresented might be overrepresented for the same kind of cultural, economic, historical reasons that are leading to the exclusion of the Chinese, right? Is there sort of the converse that would produce, huge number of Chinese, almost no prizes, and tiny number of Jews, lots of prizes? So is there a converse relationship where we could look for social and other historical factors that might lead to this sort of dramatic misrepresentation? And it's not to say that this is a lock solid case. It's simply to say that one piece of evidence, huge number of Jewish Nobel Prizes or Jews doing well in other fields of cultural expression, does not in fact make an argument necessarily for some sort of intellectual genetic superiority. Indeed, it's really obviously, I would say, an incredibly weak argument. However, this does not explain why we have this great divergence. And so asking the question, nothing wrong with asking the question. In fact, I think it's a great question to ask. However, answering it too quickly and acting as if this one single piece of evidence is a clear indicator of anything in particular is a continuous error of this kind of thinking. So you always, if possible, you want to stop and ask yourself, can I find, again, evidence to the contrary? Can I find evidence that complicates this? Can I find, any sort of, what would you call it, sort of just maybe even evidence that corroborates it and expands it? Sometimes this is helpful. You can expand the case and say, oh, see, this is a small example of a larger, more complicated effect, or something like this. And in case, again, if you think of the Jews and the Chinese as just two sides of a coin, then you go, oh, well, maybe there's a lot more complex subtlety going on here. And again, another aspect that's going on here is sort of what I call the category problem or the identity problem. This again comes from the hard sciences, physics and chemistry, where in sciences you want to control all your variables, and so they tend to use really, really well-defined terms in really, really low variable environments, as few variables as possible, with as clear evidence for what it is they're talking about as possible. And that is great if you live in those kinds of environments where it's clear what things are. Often we don't know what things are. This is one of those problems when you move out of the physical sciences, but we tend to use language as if we had the kinds of categories that they have in the hard sciences when we do not have categories. Our categories tend to be incredibly fuzzy. So back to the Jewish Nobel Prize question again, is they say, oh, well, there's this group of people called Jews, and they're a very clear defined or homogeneous group that we can track for many years, and therefore we have this close model of who they are, where they're from, what their background is. This is inaccurate. What it means to be Jewish is an open question. Not saying it can't be answered roughly. We can come up to, this is the thing, you can come up with sort of a loose definition. You just can't come up with a chemistry style of definition or a physics style of definition. For example, one thing that some genetic studies of European Jews has shown is it looks like there's a high rate of intermarriage, high-ish rate of intermarriage with the surrounding population. Now, this is not surprising. In fact, this is historically pretty much what you would expect. There's very, very few instances of highly isolated groups. Usually, you get some intermarriage to a lot of intermarriage to, oh my God, everybody's intermarrying all the time. And so the genetic studies have suggested that particularly the women, for some reason, which means that Jewish men were marrying non-Jewish women, at a higher rate than Jewish women were marrying non-Jewish men. There seems to be some evidence for that in the record. In any case, it does demonstrate that there was a fair degree of pretty steady intermarriage over many generations. So, is it a genetically isolated group? How isolated is isolated enough that you can say, oh, they're absolutely 100% a distinct group? Also, you have the notion of where are they from, geographically. What groups do you count? Is it all Jews? Is it only the Jews from one area? What happens when they move? What happens if they don't practice Judaism anymore? Is it a genetic thing? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a lineage thing? And so, the more of those questions you ask, the more complicated and fuzzy. It's, again, not that you can't come up with rough definitions, but can you come up with a clear enough evidence-based definition that allows you to say this is a stable category that allows us to draw very strong conclusions? And this, again, I mentioned this in the social sciences. Often the answer is no. This is a very vague category from which we can draw limited conclusions because it's so fuzzy and so variable. And so when you're trying to study something that has a lot of variables or a lot of variability within it, it's going to create the range around your results just becomes increasingly great. And so this is always a problem. But you see it in just all kinds of other places. So, for instance, people always want to talk about socialism or capitalism. I mean, people say I'm anti-capitalist. And I always want to say, well, okay, what do you mean by capitalism, right? Or I'm pro-socialism. I'm like, okay, what do you mean? What is that? Like that socialism does not mean hydrogen atom. There isn't like a thing with this incredibly clear definition that has, very well-known physical properties that we understand exactly how it's going to operate under, all kinds of different conditions because it's been studied very clearly under type. No, socialism is sort of an intellectual category for a vague bunch of historical processes with economics and legals and political and, it's just bleh. It's a big mess. It's a big mess. Doesn't mean we shouldn't talk about it. It just means we need to know what people mean when they say, oh, yay capitalism or yay socialism or boo socialism or boo capitalism, right? It's just like, well, what do you mean? We don't, those words don't point to clearly defined, culturally acknowledged, everybody knows what we're talking about kinds of identities. And in fact, what they do is they tend to obscure that. And so I'm pro something. And so when I use the word socialism, then it means whatever the socialism points to, that's good stuff. And if I'm against capitalism, whatever the capitalism points to, that's bad stuff, or the other way around. Some other words that don't have a lot of things that we hear all the time, like Christian. Christian means what the hell does Christian mean? I talk about this in religion. One of the things you're not allowed to ask in the United States is, what do you mean when you say Christian? Because, some Christian churches have gay ministers performing gay marriages, and some Christian churches say homosexuality is a mortal sin. Anybody who practices it will burn in hell forever. So on that doctrine, there's not a lot of agreement. In fact, there's a maximally wide amount of disagreement. So, what do you make of that? Or is one of these groups not Christian? Or is this just one of those optional beliefs that actually has nothing to do with Christianity, but that people who believe other things in common, just you can choose and throw that in there if you like? Which is it? Same thing with, Muslims. Muslim is the same way. Also, any sort of these national identities, again, I've talked about this also again before, which is the notion of national identity. Oh, my forebears, my ancestors, my genetic history goes back to France or to Germany or to Ireland or to wherever, Jamaica, and it's like, well, maybe, but what is a French marker? What is a German marker? Look at the borders of Germany over the last, say, 500 years. And you'll see like, wow, that's a amorphous, moving, alterating group of linguistically defined areas, perhaps, certainly not states, because as a state, it's not been around very long. And even then, its borders have moved quite a bit. The last 100 years of German history have been a lot of borders going in a lot of places and coming back and going away. And, it's been very dynamic on that front. So, what do you mean when France, same thing, French history is not one of a collection of totally stable borders, or Italy, or, lots of other places in the world. And so, we use these words often like they point to something that is, well known and totally established. And in fact, I heard somebody was talking about saying, I woke up one day and the USSR, which is the country I was born and raised in, no longer existed. Right? So think about that, right? The Union of the Soviet Socialist Republics just vanished. Well, not one day, but pretty quickly. It was poof, there it was. It's gone. And if you were a citizen of the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, then one day you weren't, because that thing no longer existed. And so even, when you point to something sort of in the world, it's often quite different than the way we tend to use these categories. So one of our problems is we tend to treat categories which are vague, socially defined, and often not defined in the arguments which we're paying attention to, as if they're incredibly clear, well-established, and have the sort of scientific reality that you get from objects in physics or chemistry that, in fact, really don't make any sense inside of a larger cultural argument. Another one, and this is one you see a lot, is the false dichotomy. This is where you break an argument into, it's either A or B, and then often you say A is bad, ipso facto B is good, or B is good, ipso facto A is bad, or, it's this sort of argument. It's basically also a kind of, as I mentioned before, of single piece evidence. So, again, Jordan Peterson, one of his videos says, women don't really want to be in the computer sciences. They don't participate. They participate at a low rate, but we can look in the Netherlands and Holland and stuff and say, oh, look, here's very equal societies, and even there they participate at very low rates. So therefore, ipso facto, we know women don't want to participate. So, therefore, it's not an unequal system. It is an equal system. It's just women don't want to participate, and here's one piece of evidence that demonstrates it. So one false dichotomy, either they do or they don't. And then one piece of evidence that shows that, they don't. Therefore, we're done with the argument. So it's a gross oversimplification, again, combined with the false dichotomy. Now, not to make a small, this idea is not small, but if you look at the evidence, what's very strange about the participation of women in the computer sciences, and this is from the United States, is it used to be much higher. In fact, about 37% of the degrees granted in the computer sciences in the mid-1980s went to women, which is as high as it's ever been. And then that dropped quite dramatically into the mid-90s. But weirdly, both the number of women participating in the degrees given and the number of men participating in the degrees given both dropped, which is sort of strange. And so their relative percentage didn't change too much. They dropped down to like 25 or 26, which meant men were getting more, but both men and women were getting fewer degrees. And then in the 90s, all of a sudden the men took off, but the women continued flat or actually declined. Until recently, in the last couple of years, more women have been getting degrees again, but nothing like what they used to get. So this tells us a couple of things that complicate it much more than an either-or argument. One, women are getting computer science degrees at a much lower rate than they used to be historically. So this could mean that women became less interested in computer science over time, which could be true. It could also be true that something changed about the computer science field that made women less interested in it. But there's also been wide variation over time. And by the way, when you go from getting 37% of the degrees down to like 9%, this isn't an insignificant shift, right? This is a dramatic shift. In actual total degrees granted terms, it's dropped by 2/3, right? So this is a huge, that's a massive shift in total degrees granted, particularly when you measure it against the increasing enrollment of women in higher education. as a percentage of women enrolled in higher education, the decline was even greater. But then there's been a pretty significant rebound as well. And so what this shows, if nothing else, is that women's participation in computer science programs has been surprisingly variable over the last, whatever that is, 30 years, 35 years. And, so that's not, so this doesn't mean women aren't, you can't just say women aren't interested in computer science programs. You can say that they're less interested than they used to be. And you can say their interest has been highly variable. You can also say men's interest has been pretty variable, but for some reasons, men's interest rebounded quite strongly, whereas women's interest did not until recently. That's what the evidence really suggests, and that makes it much more complicated to figure out what's going on. Now, this doesn't mean that women are interested in computer science at the same rate as men, and it doesn't mean that they should be, right? So it's not an argument, it doesn't prove any of those things. It just suggests that it's not a simple thing at all. It's not a either or. Either they're interested and you get the same amount, or they're not interested and you get a different amount. We have one piece of evidence that says they aren't that interested, therefore, hey presto, everything is right and good in the world. So that's what you're trying to avoid. And if you go and again look at all this evidence, what happens is it gets very confusing, right? This is basically what it amounts to. If you look at all these charts and graphs and look at the numbers, you go, I have no idea what's going on. At least that's what it came to me. And I haven't found out a good explanation for all of the variables that you can look at, which is generally not that surprising, again, in the social sciences. But a last piece of data that I hit upon that made me think, oh, there it is, a little more confusion for those in case we didn't have enough, is Case Western, which is a very, very, very respected school indeed. Over the last couple of years, that I had evidence for, 16, I think 17, and maybe, I think 18 is too recent. I think it was 16 and 17, had achieved like a 48.5, 51.5 ratio men to women, which suggests that they're doing something to make it almost 50-50. And the question is this an incredible outlier? Are they providing an amazing amount of incentives, or have they sort of been able to do outreach? So in any case, it demonstrates that some programs actually do achieve a kind of 50-50 balance. So there's just another piece of confusing evidence that needs to be explored and understood. But anytime, or pretty much any time, you get an either or, where it's either this or that, again, I think I talked about this in a lecture on thinking, and it's really good to stop and say, or there are third possibilities. And often the third possibility we don't like, or the one we like the least, is that this may be, at the moment, either unknowable or unresolvable, right? Often we struggle with problems because we resist the notion that this is unresolvable in any permanent sense, that we might be able to deal with it in a short term, or we might come up with a sort of provisional good enough solution or argument for today, but really we haven't achieved any sort of lasting insight because it might be unknowable with the evidence that we have available, or the evidence we have available might be so confusing and contradictory that no strong conclusions can be derived. And so often that's an actual perfectly reasonable alternative to the yes or no. And then many other alternatives are also like, we don't know, it's confusing, there's 3 other possible explanations, it could be a mix of both things. But yeah, so when it's either or and you get some piece of evidence that either proves the other thing's terrible or the one thing is good, therefore everything is proven, right? This just sort of is wrong in many directions simultaneously. So always be suspicious of that one. And mostly these work because of a crazy intellectual, basically habit, and perhaps survival habit actually, called confirmation bias. And this is where we like to find evidence that supports our ideas, and we like to not notice evidence that suggests that our ideas are faulty or wrong or incomplete. And so if I keep putting my pants on and they keep getting tighter and tighter, I want to avoid that evidence, right? Because it suggests strongly that I might have been gaining a little weight. And so I'll be able to overlook that for a long, long time. It turns out, like if we run this experiment, this is the kind of thing that we're good at. We're like, well, it just came out of the dryer. Closet shrinkage. This is my greatest theory, that your clothes often shrink when they're hanging in the closet. These sorts of problems. And eventually you might have to face it, but we're really good at avoiding that. And so what happens when we read books or listen to arguments or videos or whatnot, we tend to listen for those things that help reinforce what we already agree with, or feel that we know, and we tend to discount or not listen for those things that we disagree with or that create intellectual dissonance for us. And so we have to go, okay, so if somebody gives us an anecdote for a story that we like, oh, you should feel good about the fact that you just make great, quick, intuitive decisions. And we'll go, oh, intuitively, I like that idea. Great. Then hey, presto, I don't want to have to worry about how the world is. So if somebody tells me the world is basically great, then I'm, great. I feel good about that. I feel good where I am. The world is great. Hey, presto, right? So I'll listen to that information. And so that sort of notion of confirmation bias means that when we hear one piece of evidence, if we like it, we tend to go, okay, great, I'm just going to go with that. If we hear another piece of evidence that I don't like, then I tend to be more suspicious of that and discount it. Not that I'll check it, but I tend to be suspicious of it and push it aside and then look for evidence that I like. And so this is I guess there's some debate now. Again, of course, the whole history of U.S. slavery is up for debate, which is good and should be explored. But people tend to be trying to make this much more black and white, I guess. Can you say that in the history of slavery? Making it much more false dichotomy than history would suggest, because bizarrely, this is the thing that's confusing about it, is one of the great documents of independence and human liberty in the history of the world was the Declaration of Independence, and it was written by a group of mostly slave owners, right? And so you're like, wow. On one hand, does the document become meaningless because the guys who wrote it, and of course all guys, particularly the main, Jefferson there, not an insignificant, and he wouldn't, he was a slave owner, capital S slave owner. So you can say, oh, everything Jefferson did is pointless and meaningless because he owned slaves, but it's like, well, he did a lot of good work on human liberation and ideas of education and sort of human rights and civil liberties and recognizing the dignity of man. Now, also the people who say, well, he did all this great work, and said, let's forget about that slave owning thing. It's like, yeah, well, you don't really want to get rid of the slave owning thing either, because that's a significant part of Jefferson's persona and who he was. Washington as well, of course, so, and so what happens is we don't tend to like trying to think with both of those active at the same time. But unfortunately or fortunately, this is what we are granted in history, right? To try and eliminate that sort of dissonance is actually unrepresentative, because that dissonance is in fact there. A group of largely slave-owning intellectuals in America did write one of the great documents on human liberation that's ever been penned in sort of political or philosophical history. Of course, they were borrowing from lots of philosophical work of the Enlightenment that had been done towards these ends. But yeah, wow, that's the problematic part of it. And so whatever our bias, American history is all great and beautiful and I want to keep it clean, well, we'll just overlook the fact that they had slaves. And again, not incidentally had slaves, but like core to their entire way of life. But contrary, you can't throw away all the work and all their achievements because they did have slaves, and you can't say they did not write these documents. You can't say that these documents didn't mean anything, because not only were they not dead on the page, they just write a bunch of stuff that didn't make a difference. They wrote a bunch of stuff that really, really did make a phenomenal difference. In fact, was part of and the entire intellectual milieu that ended up making slavery illegal, which is sort of, again, wildly confusing. But in a world of almost universal slave holding, eventually it had to be slave owners or people who were related to, involved in, raised in these sorts of environments that made the arguments against holding slaves. So, you can kind of see chicken and egg problem here, right? When does it clear up? Probably never. So yeah, this is the problem of the confirmation bias, where we tend to want to downplay what we don't like, recognize and upplay what we do like. So when we get anecdotes and false dichotomies and single pieces of evidence, we go for it, because each one of those, the little story reinforces something, and there's a piece of evidence, ooh, that makes me feel even better. And then, I get the other people, we make them look bad with a false dichotomy, and boy, I feel convinced, I feel enlightened, I feel uplifted, and I'm ready to go. The sad thing, and this is where I draw my sort of unfortunate but I think fascinating and hopefully invigorating and maybe motivating perhaps conclusion, is precisely that dissonance is what we need to kind of seek, or perhaps maybe we should take as a sign that we're seeking in the right places in some ways. Because, and this comes from the Phaedrus, I'm just stealing from Socrates here, because I think it's more or less correct, as again, I always struggle with Plato, but boy, he gets some stuff so well and so clear, and the Phaedrus is one of them, where Socrates makes the argument to the young Phaedrus. He says, look, I'm paraphrasing radically here, he says, look, basically the pursuit of knowledge or wisdom, he uses, depending on the translation there, let's use knowledge in this case, make it a little less grandiose than wisdom. The true pursuit of knowledge, if you really want to know something, is essentially irrational. That it's mad. It's like romantic love. And the reason for this is you're probably going to experience like intellectual dissonance. You're going to encounter things that confuse you, that contradict things that you want to believe, that make you question yourself, that stump you, that you can't figure out, oh gosh, how many times have I run into passages that I just cannot parse? And so this is frustrating, and this makes me go, well, my first response, of course, is always, well, this writer doesn't know how to write or something like this. But then often I just have to say, no, I'm just not up to it at this point. I'm not intellectually ready. My mind's not focused right. I don't have the background. I'm not understanding the language. I have a language barrier of some kind, and you go to the original text, or it's in an original language that I'm reading in, and I don't read that language particularly well. And so it's my own ignorance. And, these sorts of struggles that you kind of going to encounter mean that actually really trying is basically makes not that much sense, right? That you really, why would you bother, right? What is the point? And for Socrates, he argues the point is in fact the struggle, that the knowing, that the breakthrough, the insight, the wisdom that might be gained. By the way, that's only a might. Sometimes you spend a lot of time and go, man, I still cannot figure this out. This is a problem that I can't quite crack, or an insight I can't make, or a passage I can't decipher. So I'm just going to have to accept that for now. Maybe later, maybe I'll make some progress and I'll be able to, figure this out, incorporate this into my mind better at some future date. But today, I can't do that. That in essence, we're struggling with our own limitations, and we're faced with a world that's huge and vast and inhumanly complicated, even though it's filled with humans. That, how can we know it? How much time should we spend asking these questions? And so what we have to do, or don't have to, you can do anything you want, one way to approach this is to say, well, how much does it matter to me? I want to approach this with an open mind, an open heart, to try and embrace the subject and try to find as much representative evidence that is fairly representative of the subject as I possibly can, and then draw a conclusion, and to consistently, but make that conclusion sort of provisional, to where you can say, well, yeah, today I feel like this, but there might be some more evidence tomorrow that strongly suggests something to the contrary, something that makes me ponder this. Just to give a kind of bizarre, technical, contemporary development, I said, if 10 years ago you would have said, nation states control fiat currencies. Yes, that's a pretty standard economic historical argument. And you go, somebody said, what are the chances that you'll have a non-nation state fiat currency? And I would have said zero-ish, but I couldn't even parse what that possibly could mean. And then all of a sudden you fast forward and, with last 10 years, all of a sudden you have whatever $1 trillion worth of cryptocurrencies trading on bizarre markets and digital backed by, stakes or proof of work but they're basically sort of crypto fiat currencies being issued by all kinds of non-state actors and being traded for real money on crazy markets. And I'm like, wow, didn't see that one coming. Wouldn't have predicted it. Not sure what it means even today. I'm not sure anybody else really knows what it means. Somebody may, but I haven't seen any convincing arguments. But, that is sort of the fundamental position that we find ourselves in. Limited people in a very large information environment. We need to make decisions. We want to try and understand the world. And so we have to draw provisional conclusions as best we can, giving our finite time and limited resources. And so there you go. And so again, when we're approaching these problems or questions or arguments, I think one thing to do, or as I mentioned, a couple of things to do is just keep these in mind. Just as a habit. These are the main ones. There's a bunch more. There's a whole list of logical fallacies. They'll have Latin names you can go through. But, I think these are the big ones. The little story that's so convincing and heartwarming, often just wrong or misleading. The single piece of evidence that seems so conclusive on its own, if you pause for a moment and go, hey, can I do a little research? Can I find some contrary arguments? Is there, again, arguments that make this much more confusing? Often, I want to say, just because every time I do research, I learn less, not more, I think, there is, and you go, oh, well, this is just much less clear than you would think it is, and so on and so forth. And then finally, fearing the false dichotomy, because so often to trying to break things down into either ors, the goodies and the baddies, the socialism versus capitalism, right? These clear categories that are broken into two parts. And then, again, like single pieces of evidence, this is generally misleading and often narrows the possibilities of thinking and understanding the world to I would argue, an unacceptable degree. And all of which serves in favor of our confirmation biases, so that we hear and learn what we want to learn, and we're reinforced rather than challenged and forced to deal with dissonance and struggle. But it's the love of knowledge that makes the struggle both great and invigorating and motivating. And so that's what I guess I would end on, is the strange argument that it's pretty much irrational to try to think about these things to the degree, certainly that I do, but that you're likely to be trying to do as well. And it has to be motivated by this bizarre love of wanting to know, really wanting to know. And so it's kind of an irrational argument for reasoned reflection on the nature of the universe, if that makes sense. Perhaps it doesn't. But that's kind of what I think needs to come into the fold to help address these kinds of problems, because they're not that complicated. It's just sort of a learned reflex when faced with sort of information or argument. But it is a lift, and it requires us to sort of pause and accept that, I don't know. I'm ignorant. It might be unknown, and it might actually cause me a little intellectual dissonance to try and face this piece of ignorance, or this piece that does show that what I had previously believed is either wrong or at least certainly vastly incomplete. So there you go, the last in the problem series, and this is the joy, I guess, of the irrational pursuit of knowledge. Thank you very much.